I'm going to introduce Mr. Stanton Friedman now. He's arguably the world's top UFO expert, and he has come all the way from Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, to be with us this morning. In case you have any doubts about UFOs, you should be prepared to lose them now. When Mr. Friedman speaks about UFOs, the world listens. He has been interviewed for more books, more TV shows, more radio shows, more newspapers, and more websites than any other person in the history of our planet. As a matter of fact, he was on last night on Coast to Coast. Mr. Friedman holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in physics from the University of Chicago, a nuclear physicist by training. He has worked for such companies as General Electric, General Motors, Westinghouse, TRW Systems, Aerojet General Nucleonics, and McDonnell Douglas. His work has included highly advanced and highly classified secret programs such as nuclear aircraft, fission and fusion rockets, and compact nuclear power plants for space and terrestrial applications. He is the original civilian investigator of the world-famous Roswell UFO incident, having co-written the top-selling book about the case, Crash at Corona, the definitive study of the Roswell incident. It is a great honor to present to you at this time Mr. Stanton Friedman.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out on a school day. I'm sure some of you are playing hooky, but that's all right. I won't tell. Spring break. Okay. That's a good excuse, isn't it? The title of my talk may seem a little strange to some people who don't think the word science and flying saucers ought to be in the same sentence. As there's nothing scientific about flying saucers, they'll tell you. I beg to differ. The key to science is, first of all, asking the right questions. And second, a very strange rule, have evidence in hand before putting mouth in gear. Unfortunately, there are a number of nasty, noisy negativists, as I call them, or ancient academics and fossilized physicists who don't believe in that. The idea is, say what you want, doesn't matter, nobody pays attention to evidence anyway. So we're going to cover a lot of ground, and this afternoon's program is a new view of the cosmos, because the times they are changing. Let me ask, how many people heard me on Coast to Coast radio this morning, last night, whatever you want to call it? They go to bed early around here. I wish I had. Okay. I'm taking all this on trust. I didn't run through these first, but I gave them the thumb drive and said, this is where they're at, so let's hope. If I push a button, what happens? There we go. It works. Thank you. And I better explain something here. Some people are upset by my use of the word flying saucers, flying saucers. Why don't you say UFOs? Because I'm not interested in UFOs. I'm interested in flying saucers. All flying saucers are UFOs. Very few UFOs are flying saucers. You know, all great-grandfathers are men. Not all men are great-grandfathers. I happen to be one, incidentally. Proud of my little one. Going to be 6 a couple months. Because I'm an old guy. That's my claim to fame. That's why I've done all those interviews. I've been around longer than anybody else. That's my book that covers the waterfront about saucers. It doesn't include all the sightings that have been made, obviously. But it's a big picture look. Can you get here from there? Is there any evidence? Why do the SETI cultists say the stupid things they say? Stuff like that. I put it out there. And there just happen to be some copies available at my table outside. Okay, evidence. Biggest study ever done was this one, Project Blue Book Special Report number 14. Was completed, the study itself was completed in 1955. Very wide distribution was given not to the report, there was no freedom of information back then, but instead to a totally misleading press release in which the Secretary of the Air Force made the following statement. On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. I feel certain that even the unknown 3% could have been explained as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been obtained. That's very straightforward. It got international distribution. The only trouble with it is it's a lie. Why would I say that about the Secretary of the Air Force? Well, because he lied. Here's a breakdown of 3,201 sightings. I need 3 hands up here. It's a little hard to do this, but okay. The ones we're interested in are the unknowns. Miscellaneous covers all kinds of stuff. This is really psychological aberrations. Crackpot cases, if you want to call it that. The American Physical Society, to which I and most physicists belong, says 2% of the papers submitted for publication by physicists are crackpot papers. There are more crackpots associated with physics than with flying saucers, it would appear. I'm one of the few with a foot in each camp, you understand. Now, he said even the unknown 3%. Why? I have no idea, because the unknowns were 21.5%. That's a long way from 3% where I come from. Also, they did a quality evaluation of all those sightings, and it turns out that the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unidentifiable. That's a pretty good test. If they weren't high quality, then it's probably can find an explanation. Now, remember, these were not the sightings for which there wasn't enough information. It was a separate category. The public wasn't told that, but I mentioned Blue Book Special Report 14, not only because it was the largest study ever done and it contains a flat-out lie by the Secretary of the Air Force, but because none of the disbelievers talk about it. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. That's the first of the 4 major rules for debunkers. The second is, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. The third is, if you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier and nobody will know the difference anyway. And 4, do your research by proclamation. Investigation's too much trouble. Nobody will know the difference. You get the SETI cultists talking, and I'll talk about that more this afternoon. There is no evidence for UFOs. They never talk about any of the large-scale scientific studies. Strange world we live in. And the media let them get away with it. The rest of the scientific community does too. Here are 2 sources. The UFO evidence on the left, data on 4,500 cases investigated for NICAP, the old National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. 18% of the cases couldn't be identified. All kinds of sightings, especially by pilots, radar cases, all that sort of stuff. And on the right, one nobody has heard of, apparently, Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects, hearings before the Committee on Science and Astronautics, U.S. House of Representatives, Congress. July 29th, my birthday, 1968. They didn't hold it because it was my birthday. 6 scientists provided testimony in person, 6 more of us in writing only. I was one of the latter group. I was the youngest and the only one without a PhD. Somebody called me doctor. I don't have a doctorate. Can't mislead the public, although it doesn't bother the debunkers to mislead. Best paper, 12 scientists now. Best paper was by Dr. James E. McDonald, a professor of physics at the University of Arizona, who talked to over 500 witnesses. His best 41 cases are in this paper. I have a few copies outside. But I mention it because there are people who tell me, oh, there aren't any good sightings, just lights in the sky. Baloney is the response to that. You could run a delicatessen with all the debunker baloney that gets put out. The so-called Condon report cost $539,000 under the direction of world-famous physicist at the University of Colorado, Dr. Edward U. Condon. If you read the press, scientist shows nothing to UFOs. No benefit to science from study of UFOs. UFOs nonsense, scientist shows. That's more malarkey. According to the UFO subcommittee of the world's largest group of space scientists, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and they wouldn't let me on the committee because I had reached a conclusion after 11 years of study, which you'd think would be grounds for why you should be on the committee, but anyway. They concluded that one could come to the opposite conclusions from Dr. Condon. that any phenomena with 30% of the 117 cases studied in detail could not be identified is certainly worthy of further scientific study. And I know people who were turned on to UFOs by reading the Condon report. So there are no laws against lying, incidentally. There are laws against libel and stuff like that. There are a lot of lies in the Condon report. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, he was chairman of the astronomy department at Northwestern for the last part of his life. He was the Air Force Project Blue Book scientific consultant on UFOs for 20 years. Now, you'd think that the astronomers who attack ufology, especially the SETI cultists, you all know what SETI stands for, Silly Effort to Investigate, S-E-T-I. They all say there's nothing to flying saucers, but none of them talk about the data. And most of them are astronomers, and you'd think they'd at least reference the book by the astronomer who had the most official involvement with UFO investigations. Oh, no, we can't do that. What the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. That's the rule. Allen was not a strong, dynamic personality. He was a decent, honorable gentleman, but a typical Czechoslovakian. They're so used to being overrun by other countries. They don't like to make waves. Don't rock the boat. It's not safe. So he was very conservative. But there are more than 70 cases in his book that couldn't be identified. You'd think the debunkers would pay attention to those, but no such luck. Okay. Now, one of the science parts of this question, of course, is you can't get here from there. How many times have I heard that? It's nonsense. It's just like, can you get from here to New York in less than a day? Not on a bicycle, but there are other means of propulsion. One of the big bits of nonsense that gets repeated over and over again is you can't get here from there. Somebody last night called into Coast to Coast talking about from thousands of light years away, look how much energy it would take, it's impossible. And I get other people talking about other galaxies. I don't care about other galaxies. I mean, our own galaxy only has a couple 100 billion stars in it. It's only 100,000 light years across. Why would anybody worry about another galaxy? There are over 1,000 stars within 50 light years of here. 1,000 stars. So don't tell me about other galaxies. But one mode of propulsion that you'd expect that would be used would be nuclear propulsion. And people look at me, what do you mean nuclear propulsion? The use of the energy of the nucleus. Now, everybody recognizes we have atomic bombs, but gee, you're not going to use that for propulsion, are you? Of course you are. Not the same thing. Way back in 1958, it seems a long time ago, this system that you see up there was tested. Those are two jet engines at the bottom. There's a nuclear reactor in that cylinder near the top. They were operated on nuclear energy. Air came in, got heated in the reactor to about 1,800 degrees, kicked out the turbines. The idea about nuclear propulsion would be that it would last for thousands of hours. You replace the pilots, but, you know, the system works for a long time. Anything is within range. And it wasn't just a small program. When I worked for GE in 1958 in Cincinnati, Ohio, did some work in Texas, too, on radiation shielding at that time, we employed 3,500 people. 1,100 of them were engineers and scientists. This was not 6 professors and 12 grad students. That year, we spent $100 million. And for 1958, that was a lot of money. And it's still a lot of money to some people today, but back then, it was a very lot of money. The program eventually got canceled. No guts. They needed an Admiral Rickover who put together the nuclear navy, who said, this is where we're going to go. You don't want to go there? Get off the train. This is what an airborne type system would look like. Reactor inside here. Air comes in, goes through the reactor, gets heated, goes out through the turbines. You got thrust. It was an exciting program. Many technical problems to solve, and we solved most of them. But when it came time to fish or cut bait, they cut bait. Sorry about that. But fission. Now, this is a nuclear ramjet. This was built in the mid-60s. The idea would be you'd launch it with a B-52, and it would carry a few H-bombs, and you could drop them any place on the face of the earth. Unlimited range. Kind of exciting. This program got canceled too. Operated the reactor, but it never got off the ground. Ramjet, nuclear ramjet. Ling Temco Vought was the prime contractor. Now we get to the nuclear rockets. A whole series were built or designed or talked about. Power levels were 100 megawatts, 1,000 megawatts, 5,000 megawatts. And you can see from the size of the man how small these are compared to your notion of a big Saturn V, let's say. These would not be launched from Earth. I mean, they'd be launched from Earth, but they were not powered here. They were not launch vehicles. When you get up in orbit, then you turn them on. And this wasn't just a talking program. I worked on this program. Here's an idea of how it works. Liquid hydrogen, very cold, comes in, goes down, cools the control systems, comes down, goes out through the nozzle at about 4,000 degrees. And because there's no oxygen, the molecular weight is low, which means the velocity is high. This is the Westinghouse NRX A6. I worked on this. The reactor's in here. Less than 8 feet in diameter. Power level, 1,100 megawatts. Grand Coulee Dam produces 2,000 megawatts. That gives you some idea. A lot of oomph in a small space, which is the whole point, of course. Low weight. Los Alamos built several Phoebus reactors. They were a little larger. The biggest one produced 4,400 megawatts, twice the power of Grand Coulee Dam. Was operated successfully at the nuclear test site not far from Area 51. This is back in the 60s, mind you. This isn't imaginary. It would triple how much you could send to Mars. Be an upper stage. No guts. Nobody's going to Mars yet. There's one operating out in the desert. These are tanks of liquid hydrogen to the left, and you don't want to be around close to these things when they're running. Radiation levels are humongous. And Area 51 is over the hills. The program was canceled. It operated successfully, but the program was canceled. Now, ideally, don't let the equation scare you. You go from fission to fusion. So let me give you a little history lesson. In 1944, a big bomb was a 10-ton blockbuster dropped by a B-29. Released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. Make a big hole in the ground. That was in 44. Our first atomic bomb, fission weapon, the next year, 1945, released the energy of 18,000 tons of TNT. We were just getting started, because then we went to nuclear fusion reactions like these shown up here. And if you use the right ones in the right way, you can produce a lot of energy. Our first H-bomb, hydrogen bomb, fusion bomb, produced the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. So in less than 10 years, you went from a conventional dumb old TNT bomb, if you will, to a fusion weapon. And the Russians tested one, 57 million tons of TNT. That's a lot of energy. If you dropped one in the middle of New Jersey, you'd set fires from New York to Philadelphia. Having lived in New Jersey, I can think of some people who say, hey, that's not a bad idea. But anyway, we don't want to talk about that. Now, let's look at this a little carefully. This is helium, He. The lightest substance in the universe is hydrogen. And more than 90% of the universe consists of hydrogen. H2O, water, that hydrogen. Okay, deuterium is heavy hydrogen. Very important in the universe. Most of us never see it. Anyway, when you react those things, you produce lots of energy. That word MeV, millions of electron volts. Normal chemical reactions, you light a match, your car, etc., produce the energy of 5, 10, 20 electron volts. This releases 18 million electron volts, which is kind of impressive. Now, I should mention about fusion. It's a very widespread source of energy because all of the stars in the universe produce their energy by nuclear fusion. Every civilization, when it gets to a point when it's curious and it's technological, will try to figure out, how does that star, the sun, produce all that energy? We figured it out in 1938. 1952, first H-bomb. So an incredible progression. Once we decided to spend the money, the Manhattan Project cost a lot of money, billions of dollars. Just to separate uranium-235 from uranium-238, we built a facility that was a mile long in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. We used 5% of the electrical power produced in the United States to push a gas containing uranium through little holes in a barrier. By the time it got out, there was more uranium-235 and less 238. You keep doing this, and eventually you enrich the uranium. 5% of the electrical power in the United States was used for that, in secret. The reason it was in Tennessee was Tennessee Valley. They had lots of electricity produced. So you move on to fusion, and you want to get clever. You try to produce use the reactions that have charged particles. Why? So that you can accelerate them out the back end. If you produce neutrons, which go out in all directions, don't do you much good. You can collect the heat, but that doesn't get you anywhere. But if they're charged particles, you kick them out the back end, and you go that way, and the particles go that way. I was involved in a study of nuclear fusion for deep space propulsion in 1961. It's not a new idea. A number of studies have been published. We didn't build a big system because we're talking billions of dollars. And we don't have any plans to go to deep space. But we know how to do it. We know how to get to the moon in 1945. We didn't spend the money to do it then because it took a lot of technology that needed development. So nuclear fusion is my first choice for deep space probes. It's not the only choice. But if that'll do the job, then let's go for that, if you want to go to the stars. And again, I'm not saying we should. We have our own problems here. Why should we take our brand of friendship, everybody else calls it hostility, out there? Well, you know, I get people saying stupid things. Why don't they land on the White House lawn, the aliens? If they're coming here, they would want to talk to us, wouldn't they? I don't talk to the squirrels in my backyard. I mean, are we worth talking to? The President of the United States, and I know this will surprise you, does not speak for 7 billion Earthlings. Sometimes he doesn't speak for 300 million Americans, 310 million. But one good reason for coming here is to make sure we don't go out there. If you were an alien, would you want Earthlings out there? A couple of facts. World War II, we killed 50 million of our own kind. 50 million. We destroyed 1,700 cities. This year we will spend $1 trillion on things military. Are we nice guys? Can you understand why aliens wouldn't want us out there? We went through a Pearl Harbor. You think they're going to wait till somebody gets on their doorstep and says, up with your hands, we want everything you got? Makes no sense. We have made it clear to the universe, local neighborhood anyway, that we're not good guys. We have much too much technology and much too little sociology. Killing is a way of life for us. like it or not, I'm not saying that's what we should be doing, but let's face the facts. So nuclear fusion is my first bet, and of course the noisy negativists never talk about it. But of course there's a bigger problem. Usually the SETI cultists and other astronomers think that research only goes on in academia. When I tell them we were spending $100 million a year in 1958 at GE, they look at me like I'm nuts. The stealth aircraft, was built at a cost or developed at a cost of $10 billion in secret. Not 20 professors and 40 grad students. I've had people tell me, Stan, if Roswell really happened, they'd have had to pull half the physicists out of the colleges in the country to deal with it. And I laughed. How utterly absurd. The 3 nuclear weapons labs, 10 years back, their total budget was more than the budget of the National Science Foundation for all its research. Los Alamos employed 7,000 people, thousands of them engineers and scientists. Not the kind of thing you do in academia very much. So nuclear fusion, my best bet for deep space travel. Everybody out there who's at least 100 years ahead of us is certainly going to know about it. That's another part of the problem. We think, first of all, until a few years ago, and I'll talk about this afternoon, ain't nobody out there. If there were, they would have come here and talked to us, and we would know that they were there. Absence of evidence is evidence for absence, isn't it? Not to a scientist, it isn't. It means we don't know. We haven't been able to look. And as I will mention this afternoon, times have changed. From thinking there might be 8,000 planets in the galaxy, now the conservative estimates are, 8 to 15 billion planets in the galaxy. Uh-oh, we're not on top of the heap, are we? Sorry. So we don't need to look very far to come up with the technique that will do the job. Not saying that it's the best. My computer of 5 years ago can't compete with today's computers. But it did the job. And there were guys who used slide rules, incidentally, to do some of the big jobs during World War II. Everybody here, how many of you know what a slide rule is? We got some. Good. I gave a talk at a college in Michigan, and I mentioned slide rules as something that's passé. That I used one when I started working in industry, but nobody in the room knew what a slide rule was. That was less than 50 years before. So I'm very careful about assuming what people know, Frequently, it's not a lot. Okay. The real question is, never mind the saucer. Did you see the guys who were driving? Does a nuclear physicist believe in little green men? Well, they're not green, and they are little, and whether they're men or women or both or neither, I don't know. But we have loads of cases in which perfectly respectable, responsible Earthlings, which I presume most of you are. If you're not from Earth, let me know later, please. Have seen not only craft on or near the ground, but craft accompanied by typically little guys. Now, that bothers some people. There are also the abduction cases. They bother some other people. You got to go where the data is, whether you like it or not, whether you have an explanation for it or not. It's real. We didn't know that the sun was fusioning 50 years ago, 80 years ago, but it was. So sometimes we have to catch up with reality. So how about little guys? Yes, I believe that some Earthlings have on occasion observed aliens, intelligent aliens. I mean, you might question their intelligence. What the heck are they doing here? But, that's a separate question. Now, a man named Ted Phillips has collected more than 4,000 physical trace cases from 80 countries. Cases where the saucer is seen on or near the ground, and after it leaves, one finds physical changes, the equivalent of burn circles, burn rings, landing gear marks, footprints, little ones. 1/6 of those cases involve reports of typically small beings associated with the craft. They're out picking up specimens, They're checking things out. They're grad students doing their thesis research. I don't know what the heck they're doing. Why do people travel? Is there one reason? Go to Houston Airport. Is there one reason why all those people are in the airport? No, there's loads of reasons. Some are athletes, some are criminals, some are visiting Aunt Millie. There's a whole spectrum of choices. So we don't know what these guys are doing necessarily. And they're not reporting to the customs officer when they cross the border, as I have to do, living in Canada as I do. But yes, there are many excellent reports of little guys. Does that mean I believe every story I hear? Of course not. Most isotopes aren't fissionable. If I want to build a reactor, I use the one that is. What do I care about the ones that aren't? Talk to the basketball coach. He knows most people aren't 7 feet tall. He says, don't tell me about the midgets. Give me one big guy. Medical researchers. Most chemicals will kill you, not cure you. But fortunately, there are some persistent good scientists who keep checking and trying and finally wind up with good ones. Maybe it's 1 in 100, if you're lucky. I don't recommend investments in drug companies unless you check it out, because most of the things they try don't work. But hopefully they try them without trying them on people. Minor detail. Anyway, there are little guys. Humanoid, typically. How could they possibly look like us? I don't know. Maybe we have a common ancestry. Maybe we're a penal colony. They dumped all the bad boys and girls here, and that's why we're so nasty to each other. I don't know how many of you have been to Australia, but they're very proud of their convict ancestry, believe it or not. In Georgia, they're not so proud. They got convict ancestors, too. So you got to be real careful about jumping to conclusions about things. You don't always have a why in hand. That's one of those physical trace cases I was mentioning. That's from Delphos, Kansas. I've been there. Ronnie Johnson, age 16, finishing his chores for the evening, sees this bright object a foot or two off the ground, 50, 60 feet away. He's standing there just staring at it, and he's temporarily paralyzed. He didn't see any beings. This thing finally takes off slowly, dashes into the house, tells his parents. They look out the window, they see it. They go back to where it had been on the ground. They found this dry ring of soil. Down 14 inches it was dry. Samples were, they called the sheriff. Sheriff came. He called Ted Phillips, or Ted Phillips heard about it, this guy who collects all these cases. Got samples, sent some to me, matter of fact. On the left is normal soil. On the right is the ring soil. I had good tests run, smaller, higher level of salty stuff. It's too salty to grow any plants. For 2 years, nothing grew in this area. One of the better early cases that Ted has collected. He was in the neighboring state of Missouri. This was in Kansas, Delphos, Kansas. There are loads of cases like this. Now, I know some people get upset at me. They see that paper plate. What kind of science is that, Stan? When I was at the University of Chicago, there was a Nobel Prize-winning physics experiment done. And one of the key pieces of equipment was held up by an empty coffee can, which just happened to be the right size. If they can use a coffee can, I can use a paper plate, darn it. Cheap and adequate for the purpose. Now, abduction cases. Now, that word bothers some people. I'm sorry about that. Enough kidnappings around for us to know that people do get abducted by earthlings, no less aliens. I've never heard of an alien holding an earthling for a ransom, which goes on in some parts of the world fairly often. This is the famous couple, Betty and Barney Hill, and their dog. And yes, I've met them both. And this took place in New Hampshire in 1961. They were driving along out in the middle of nowhere. Betty spots something strange in the sky. They'd been to Canada, were heading back to their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She sees this thing. They drive south. Seems to be sort of following them. she tells Barney there's a UFO up there, and Barney says, "Come on, Betty, there are no UFOs. Probably a Piper Cub. Don't worry about it." They keep going. This thing gets closer. There's a lot of other details you got to read the book to get at, but it gets closer and finally stops, skipping a lot of detail, less than 100 feet away. This is late at night, nobody around, September 21st, 1961. Barney gets out of the car. This thing is sitting right up there. It's a double row of windows. Has binoculars. Can see beings inside. Scares the heck out of him. This thing was silent. They're out in the boonies. These guys are making meaningful actions at what seems to be a control board. Dashes back to the car, tells Betty, "They're going to get us." Gets very frightened of being captured. They drive off. Barney does something very strange. Goes off the main road to a secondary road and then to a tertiary road. Something he would never do. And there's a vehicle in front of them, some kind of crazy vehicle. Little guys. They take them out of the car, take them on board this craft, which has landed in the only place suitable for landing in the area. It was sandy ground. It's very heavily treed out there. They get taken on board. This is what we know from later. Physically examined, separate rooms, treated as specimens, stick a needle here, scrape a little skin there, that sort of thing. Put back out, told they wouldn't remember what happened, and didn't. But they got home 2 hours later than they should have gotten home. That was weird. Betty called her sister, who had had a sighting a few years before, and told her about seeing this thing. And the sister's neighbor suggested they check, I don't know why, check the trunk with a compass, see if there's any action there. There are a bunch of silver dollar side spots on the trunk. And you put a compass nearby, it went crazy. Move it away, it stopped. That was weird. And they reported it to Pease Air Force Base. The big thing was this missing time. What happened? 2 hours later than they should have been? This is weird. Anyway, they went on about their business. They developed some physical symptoms. Barney developed ulcers. Doctor says after a year or so, "Barney, I can't do anything more for you. I think you ought to see a psychiatrist." Something that was before they knew about bacteria causing ulcers. It's probably psychiatric, So they got a recommendation. They wound up going, very fortunately, to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a very well-known psychiatrist, one of the world's experts on the treatment of shell-shock war veterans, they called it back then. Today we'd say PTSD. That sounds so much more sophisticated. Dr. Simon's approach, which was honed by years of expertise, he ran a hospital for 3,000 beds for veterans with PTSD. He didn't know anything about flying saucers, but he sure knew a lot about helping veterans get back to being part of the human race. Your buddy's head gets blown up next to you. How do you handle that? That sort of thing. Regressive hypnosis, medical hypnosis, to try to relive the experience and get it out of their system, so to speak. That's what he did with Betty and Barney. The tapes are available now. They weren't back then for many years. What came out under hypnosis was that they had been taken on board, examined, put back out, told they wouldn't remember, and didn't. There were several other features of those events, if you will. And you almost have to read one of the books to get them. They had never expected to go public with this. One of the exciting things is a star map. Betty, under hypnosis, is reliving how the leader of this crew is responding to her question. She says, "I know you're not from around here," understatement of the month. "Where are you from?" And he shows her a three-dimensional model with stars connected with lines for heavy trade routes, light trade routes, occasional expeditions. "Well, where are you on a map?" she says. You know where you are? No, I don't know anything about astronomy. Well, how can I tell you where I'm from if you don't know where you're at? End of discussion. Dr. Simon asks her, fortunately, if she can remember what the map looks like under hypnosis. She said yes. He gives her a post-hypnotic suggestion. Please draw it later on, as long as you can remember it accurately. She does, and it's in the book. Base stars, heavy trade routes, light trade routes. But what does it mean? Where is it? We have no idea. A couple 100 billion stars in the galaxy. Obviously, they're not all in the map. Anyway, a tremendous amount of work was done by a woman named Marjorie Fish, building three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood, and eventually being able to identify all the stars in the map. There's Marjorie, brilliant woman. You can see how long ago this picture was taken. Look at the color of my beard. Early 70s. I've been at this a long time. This is one of the models she built, 27 of them altogether. This one has a few hundred stars in it. She was looking for a three-dimensional pattern that matched the two-dimensional drawing that had been made. Had no idea whether she'd be able to find a pattern, but it was worth the effort. She visited Betty to get as much detail as she could. And pretty soon she was reading the literature, and some astronomers were saying, well, these kinds of stars won't have planets, and these won't have planets, and so forth. So she kept culling down the number of stars in the model. Finally, she found one and only one pattern that matched angle for angle, line length for line length, what Betty had drawn. It was a big day. It enabled her to identify all the stars in the pattern. This is from one of her patterns. Matched angle for angle, line length for line length, what Betty had drawn. And they're the names of the stars. Now, we had lousy distance data. That was the difficult part of this. Because you can look at a star by knowing two angles. Doesn't matter whether it's 50 light years away or 20 light years away. Astronomers aren't going anywhere. What difference does a distance make? Turns out the base stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli, that's the constellation of Reticulum. You can't see it from here. Got to go below the equator. It turns out they're a unique pair of stars. They're the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire local neighborhood. The sun is isolated, just several light years to the next star over. These two stars are only 39 light years now, we know, from here. But they're only an eighth of a light year apart. They're 30 times closer to each other than the sun is to the next star over. We're out in the boondocks. These guys got next-door neighbors. Oh, also, they happen to be a cool billion years older than the sun, so they've had plenty of time and incentive, because of having a neighbor, to develop interstellar travel. Billion years is a long head start on us, one would think. And from a planet around one of these two stars, you can see the other star all day long, which is kind of neat. You can make lots of measurements. You can tell whether there's vegetation on the planets, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a great discovery, fascinating piece of work. I wrote the first article about it. I convinced the editor of Astronomy magazine to do an article about it. Got more response than anything they'd ever published. And over the next year, they published a dozen letters. And then they put together a 32-page full-color supplement and sold 10,000 copies immediately, which is unheard of in this business. But it had, that's the 32-page full-color item, it had Carl Sagan's name on the front. He threatened to sue him. It turned out the editor had a brain tumor and died within 6 months. But they made me an offer I couldn't refuse because I had instigated the study. And I wound up with 18,000 copies in my garage in California. Moved some of them, most of them, to my home in Fredericton, New Brunswick when we moved there, and I don't have a one. You can see it on the internet. Very exciting piece of work. And it's the kind of approach that should be taken, except that you won't believe the nasty things that were said by some of the astronomers. You know, how dare an astronomical publication write anything about UFOs? Come on. That was being nice, to say the least. Anyway, it's an exciting piece of work. I think some of them come from Zeta Reticuli. Now, let's get the picture. The galaxy, the Milky Way, is about 100,000 light years across. Maybe 200 billion stars. These guys are just down the street. There are more than 1,000 stars within 50 light years of here. So don't go telling me about intergalactic travel or the far reaches of the galaxy. I don't care. Let's just go down the street. I'd be happy with a trip to Zeta Reticuli, 1 or 2. Reticulum means the net in Latin, in case you're interested. It's ensnared a lot of people in this discussion, to say the least, if you'll pardon the terrible pun. But anyway. So this is how you use science. Marjorie didn't know what the results would be, but she built the models, and she looked at them from all different directions. She was a very objective, careful, brilliant woman. I was very impressed. She was also a sculptress. And based on Barney's description and Betty's description, this is the head of it, the alien, a Zeta Reticulan, your typical Zeta Reticulan, you know. They weren't all cookie cutters, you know, exactly the same. Here's our book captured. The co-editor, the co-author was Kathleen Marden, who just happens to be Betty's niece and has all the tapes, and heard about this story the day after it happened when Betty called Kathy's mother. She did 85% of the work. They put my name first because it'll sell more. What do you say when the publisher says that? You don't say anything. Okay. Well, you know, I protested to them. I said, this is Kathy's book. Stan, you're better known. This is several years ago. It'll sell more. That's a very convincing argument. I don't know how many of you have written books, but most publishers don't want to go with somebody who says, well, I don't care if it sells. Sorry, the publisher does. Then there's the Roswell case. I'm the original civilian investigator of the Roswell case. I was in the right place at the wrong time, if you will. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I was at a television station to do 3 interviews before my lecture that night at Louisiana State University. I did the first 2. The third reporter was nowhere around. This is in 1978. The station manager, he knew the people who brought me to the station. He knew I had other things to do. He's giving me coffee. He's looking at his watch. Out of the blue, he says, you ought to talk to Jesse Marcel. Brilliant investigator that I am. I said, who's he? His response changed my life. He handled wreckage of one of those saucers you're interested in when he was in the military. What? Where'd that come from? You know, what do you know about him? He lives in Houma. Thanks a lot. That didn't tell me anything because I didn't know where Houma was. I've been there since. He's a great guy. We're old ham radio buddies. You ought to talk to him. The reporter showed up, had a great response that night. The next day from the airport, I called information for Jesse Marcel in Houma, wherever it was. He told me a story. He couldn't deny his involvement, as I found out later, because his name was in newspapers all over the place. He didn't have a precise date. I knew 47 was a big year for UFO sightings. Heard a second story in a small town called Bemidji, Minnesota, Bemidji State College. My colleague Bill Moore heard from an English actor. There's an article about him. He heard while driving across the country about a crash saucer in New Mexico. What Jesse told me was a rancher had come into the sheriff's office with pieces of crazy wreckage. Sheriff called the base in Roswell, the home of the only atomic bombing group in the entire world. Wasn't a bunch of dinks with nothing better to do but twiddle their thumbs and make up stories. They're the guys who dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 2 more at Operation Crossroads in the Pacific in 1946. People have said, oh, that base commander must have been nuts. Sure, he got 4 promotions to 4-star general and was vice chief of staff of the Air Force when he died of a massive heart attack. Not exactly a loose cannon, as somebody liked to call him. Anyway, and there were people who tell you, why did it appear only in a small-town newspaper? It didn't. It appeared in evening papers from Chicago West. This is the Chicago Daily News and California papers all over the place. The timing is because the press release that was put out at the order of the base commander went out about noon New Mexico time, too late for all the East Coast papers, just in time for Chicago West. And the West Coast paper, as a matter of fact, had both stories. Army captures flying saucer. General says it's radar weather gadget. Took 4 hours for the 2 press releases to come out. And until I got involved, we heard almost nothing about this. Bill Moore and I located 62 people in the next year and a half. It was 92 by 1986. You will read more baloney. There's that delicatessen source again about Roswell from people who don't know a damn thing about it and haven't been there and haven't talked to the witnesses. But no, it couldn't possibly have been an alien craft. One big skeptic, some PR guy made up the story to get attention. He didn't even know his name. I've been in the guy's house. The PR guy at Roswell would never have put out such a press release without approval of the boss. He'd have been in the brig so fast you couldn't see him go. It's a long story, and I don't want to tell it all here, but Roswell's an important event. You got to be careful when you read the books. I recommend going to Roswell. I'll be there to give 3 lectures at the festival in early July. Gets very hot, but you guys know about things getting hot, so that's no surprise. It's an important story. An earth-shaking event, if you will. So it's no surprise that a bunch of phony stories have been put out as well. That's what you do when good stuff leaks. You put out bad stuff, so people will associate the bad stuff with the good stuff and say, oh, that's baloney too. They really build on the baloney supply. RAAF, one person insisted that was Royal Australian Air Force. Sorry, it was Roswell Army Airfield. There are loads of clippings. It's a big story. Most of the people are dead now, as you might expect. I have some copies of a DVD with testimony from 27 first-hand witnesses, almost all of whom are dead now, not surprisingly. But you can hear the people in their own words. Of course, living here in Texas, you know where Roswell is. Albuquerque up here, Roswell down here. This is the White Sands Missile Range, the largest military base in the continental United States. It's an exciting story. There's Jesse Marcel with some of the phony wreckage that was brought in. General Ramey, the head of the 8th Air Force, told him, you don't say anything. I'll take care of it. Explained it away. Sorry about that. We made a mistake. Sure, the base intelligence officer doesn't know a radar reflector weather balloon combination. They use them all the time. He had to brief B-29 pilots on what the weather was going to be on their long missions, simulating atom bomb runs and so forth. But the press bought it. After all, we just won the war. You believe what the government says. Strange world we live in. There's General Ramey on the left. He's holding a little memo in his hands. And modern technology enables us to read that memo, we think. I've got a DVD out there with many views of this memo. Nobody expected anybody to be able to read this now, of course. This was back, a speed graphic camera, incidentally, very high resolution. Much better than today's several megapixel cameras. Exciting piece of work. There's Dubose. He was with Ramey. I decided maybe he had gone to West Point, so I checked with West Point. I knew Ramey was dead. Blanchard, the base commander, was dead. Dubose was still alive. I managed to find him, visit with him in Florida twice. He's one of the people on that DVD with the 27 witnesses from Roswell. He told me, standing 2 feet away from me, that he took the call from General Ramey's boss telling him 3 things. I want you to get the press off our back. I don't care how you do it. Send some of that wreckage up here today to Washington from Texas with one of your Colonel Couriers. And I don't want you ever to talk about it again, not even with your buddy Roger Ramey. That's an order. Do I need to put it in writing, Colonel? No, sir. When a 2-star general tells a colonel what to do, both West Pointers, they do it. I get people who Can't understand why Dubose didn't protest. When the general says do something, you do it. He took us to the best restaurant in town, incidentally. He still had all his marbles. Believe me, he did. Yeah, that was another article in the paper. If I find another one, said the rancher, I'm not going to tell anybody about it. Oh, the Roswell report. The Air Force decided to put out 2 reports. The first one said that was going to be the last word, and they lied, and they put out another one. About the size of a New York phone book. They lie about me. Fortunately, I'm getting my revenge. A publisher has put out these 2 reports, and at the top it says, with a new foreword by Stanton Friedman, author of Crash at Corona, the definitive story of the Roswell incident. And I have a foreword over a page long, and I'm waiting for some Air Force guy to say, what in the world is going on here? You can't copyright government documents, you see. And inside it's got my name under the author's name. And I'm just laughing to myself. Get my revenge. Oh, one of the silliest explanations. You know those crash test dummies? Well, we Air Force guys were smart. We dug into our history and we found that we were dropping crash test dummies all over New Mexico. I found the man on the right. This picture's in the book, the 2nd volume. And there are a few problems with the crash test dummy explanation. First, this is what the dummies looked like. 6 feet tall, 175 pounds, and wearing a flight suit. Because if you go out at 50,000 feet, will you freeze to death or not going down? You know, the suit influences the drag, the heating, and so forth. Of course, there was another problem. None of these were dropped until 1953, so we have time travel for crash test dummies. Why don't we use it for people? I mean, you know, why didn't the New York Times play this on the front page? Explanation found. I had no trouble finding Matson. He was a retired colonel when I found him, the guy on the right. I met with him in person in Albuquerque. First-hand testimony. But crash test dummies. Now, can you tell me that any rancher or anybody else in New Mexico finding one of these on the ground would have said, oh, my God, an alien invasion? How absurd can you get? Like all the television movies, you notice the cigarette in the other guy's hand. If you look at old movies, it's one of the things that leaps out at you. Everybody's smoking. Because people told us that was good for you. They were wrong. Then we have the Majestic 12 problem, and I don't have time to go into it. A roll of film arrived with this top secret document, top secret magic document, purporting to say that the government set up a group called Majestic 12. Truman set it up, listed the 12 guys who were members of it. It's a long, involved story, and there are over 100 phony documents. I think 3 of the documents, however, are genuine. The most important classified documents ever leaked to the public. I've written a whole book about it. The real surprise here was Dr. Donald Menzel, who was a total skeptic, we thought. I went to the archives at Harvard, had permission from 3 people to view his papers. Turned out he spent more than 30 years, among other things, working for the National Security Agency, doing classified work for dozens of companies, and telling President Kennedy, whom he knew, when we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more about the NSA, National Security Agency. I've had a longer continuous association with them, 30 years, of anybody in the country. Nobody knew that. Very exciting stuff. I have a book, Top Secret Magic, about this, but it's a scientific detective story, and there may be a movie this year. Magic Men, M-A-J-I-C. The movie rights to the book, Top Secret Magic, have been purchased. A screenplay has been written. That doesn't mean the movie's going to be made, but I'm hopeful. They've also bought the rights to Captured. Again, who knows? They may have 2 movies out there. I hope it's while I'm alive. It'd be nicer that way. I won't go into this because there just isn't time, except to point out that One of the documents led one of the debunkers to say, oh, it's all baloney. It's the wrong size type. That's pica type. It should be elite type. He offered me $100 for every genuine such memo done in the same size and style type as that memo. Set a limit of 10, unfortunately. I was going to the Eisenhower Library. He'd never been there. I got 14 documents done in the same size and style type. Sent him an invoice. He paid me. Didn't tell anybody about paying me. He told everybody about challenging me. And there is no Friedman class file at his papers at the American Philosophical Society Library. I wonder why. I don't think he wants anybody to know that he was totally off the wall. He threatened to sue me because I use this in a book, incidentally. I told him, look, you sent me the check. I Xeroxed it. I took it to the bank. They honored the check. I can do whatever I please with the Xerox. You shut up. There's the book, Top Secret Magic. There are a few copies out here. This is by Jesse Marcel's son, Colonel Dr. Jesse Marcel, who handled wreckage when he was 11. Outstanding individual. There's my book, Crash at Corona. Corona's the small town closest to where the event took place. There's Recollections of Roswell. I won't go into the details of what's wrong with the debunkers. Take too long. A few quick pictures. Hawaii. This is in Salt Lake City, Utah. The Mormon Temple is over there. Good pictures. Daytime. I think that's an ionized air plasma around this craft related to a magneto-aerodynamic propulsion system. This is in Santa Ana, California. You notice these are not nighttime pictures of lights in the sky. I really don't care about them. Not much you can do with them. There's a blow-up of that last one. Detailed investigation says it's real. McMinnville, Oregon. Even the Condon people said they couldn't identify this. A series of pictures off the island of Trinidad off the coast of Brazil. To the right. The whole deck full of Navy people who saw this. Official Navy, Brazilian Navy photographer who took the pictures. And Dr. Bruce Maccabee, an optical physicist, has published papers about the adequacy of these from a scientific viewpoint. If we know how to build things that look like that and fly like that, we would, and they'd be used for military purposes. If it wasn't made here, it was made someplace else. Doesn't say how, why, where, when, but not from here, and that's a big statement. Oh, there's no cover-up. Well, except this is a typical CIA UFO document, and don't say scrape off the black. They Xerox it first. They're not stupid. This is CIA. This is my favorite. Deny in toto. They couldn't find 8 lousy words to declassify on this. This is about what happened in West Virginia, Flatwoods. Great case. I've got a few copies. Here's a DVD that covers the waterfront. Seth Shostak and I, we have debated. I won 57-33-10 on Coast to Coast for 3 hours. Nice guy. Doesn't know a darn thing about flying saucers. He says he has a copy of my book on his nightstand. Hasn't read it. Enrico Fermi, the supposed Fermi paradox. Great scientist. People say he says there were no visitors. He didn't. He said, where is everybody after a discussion? He was famous for teaching. I was at Chicago when he was there. Famous for teaching by asking questions. I don't know where everybody is. I know some of them are coming here. There's my book. There's Arthur C. Clarke. Thanks for listening. And you're out of this world. I almost hit my time limit. Thank you very much. This afternoon, it'll be a new view of the cosmos, looking at the bigger picture of where do we fit in the scheme of things. Are we the big shots? Nah. Thank you for listening. I'll be at my table. I was thinking we were starting at 10 o'clock, and I was thinking, there's my 90 minutes. If anybody's got a question, I'll try to answer. Nobody's got any questions. Anybody have any questions? Is there a hand up there? I can't see. There's one. The question is, what about people who say that aliens are demonic in nature, not extraterrestrial? Where do I stand on that? I recommend people to the book Flying Saucers and the Bible by Dr. Barry Downing, who's a clergyman. He's got a bachelor's in physics and a doctor of divinity. That's an unusual combination. And he goes through the Old and New Testament, many examples of what we would call UFO reports. Pillar of fire by night, the cloud by day, Ezekiel's wheel, and there's a whole bunch of these things. I disagree with the notion they're demonic. That's based on an assumption that there ain't nobody out there. I go along with the Pope, who a few years ago said he sees no reason why God couldn't have made our brethren in outer space as well as us. My first thought when I heard that was, who's he been talking to, frankly? So I do not believe we're dealing with demons. Of course, the people who espouse that, Pat Robertson, for example, have loudly claimed that the only intelligent life in the universe is here on Earth. And I keep saying, is there intelligent life on Earth? Well, how many thousand people died yesterday of preventable disease and starvation while we will spend $1 trillion this year on things military? That doesn't compute, that we're an advanced civilization. So the Bible, there's a lot of work going on, I'll call them old UFO stories if you want. There's a lot of art from the Middle Ages, which has UFOs in the pictures. Where does that come from? And that's part of what I'll be talking about this afternoon, which is the sense that, are we on the top of the heap? If you think we're the most advanced civilization in the universe, that's one thing. I have no reason to think that, partly because we haven't been around very long. We've had long-distance radio since 1901. The Earth is like 4 billion years old. If somebody got started 100 years before us, or 1,000 or 1,000,000, they're way ahead of us. Progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. So I think there's no basis at all for saying they're demons. If you say it's because they're smarter than us, well, that's just jealousy, I guess. But well, you get my point, though, that I do not buy into that explanation. I've done a little digging, and I just can't find any support for us. And especially I recommend, and we'll talk about that this afternoon, the Kepler space satellite. It has turned up so many planets, it's unbelievable. They're all over the place out there. We used to think we have the only solar system, and we're the most advanced beings. As a matter of fact, until 1924, we thought we were the only galaxy. There's billions of them out there. So arrogance and ignorance lead to some strange positions. And so I don't think the explanation is that they're demons at all. And if you look at the Hill case, they didn't act like what I would expect a demon to act. I don't have any personal experience to relate, but so good question. Other question. Yes? Well, some people say they violate the laws of physics. That's the most common objection from the noisy negativists. But they don't understand the laws of physics. Let me give you an example. Back in 1941, there was a lot of science fiction about going to the moon. So an astronomer, Dr. Campbell, did a paper in which he calculated the required initial launch weight of a rocket able to get a man to the moon and back. Legitimate question. How big would the darn thing have to be? 1941. Pages of equations. Bottom line, it would have to weigh 1,000,000 tons. Even for me, that's too big. The Apollo rocket that sent us to the moon weighed 3,000 tons at launch. He was off by a factor of 300 million because he made every possible stupid assumption about how you go about doing it. And that's what you normally find. The assumptions are wrong. For example, you can't stand the acceleration. There's a book, Physics for People Who Say They Don't Like Physics. When you get to 9 G's, you die. That's balderdash. We got loads of data on how many G's people can stand. Oh, if you hit a wall when you're being accelerated at 9 G's, yeah, you'll be splattered all over the landscape. A couple of numbers. A trained pilot can perform a tracking task while being accelerated at 14 G's for 2 minutes. That's an acceleration of 300 miles per hour per second. Per second. So at the end of the 2 minutes, you'd be going 36,000 miles an hour, and you'd be long since out of sight and off the Earth. Let's measure data on big centrifuges, because we have to know with airplanes how many G's a pilot can stand. I've tried a little experiment. Sometimes when I'm on campus, some professor will say, hey, why don't you let him do a colloquium? We'll put him in his place. So I do, and I make sure I talk about a number of things. This is in the afternoon before an evening lecture. And I'll talk about a number of things that I know they don't know anything about. And you're all familiar with this. No, nobody is. And I go through several of these, so they know their professors aren't really up on things. Then I'll try a little ploy. What's the numerical value of 1 G acceleration? 9.8 meters per second squared. They all say that. I say, okay, how do you relate that to the real world? We don't measure anything else in how many meters per second squared. Well, that's 21 miles per hour per second. So if a car is accelerating at 1 G, at the end of 3 seconds, it's going 63 miles an hour. And it's a pretty hot car, because most cars take 4, 5, 6 or more seconds to get to 60 miles an hour. Then I say, what's the speed of light? 300,000 kilometers per second. I say, again, how do you relate that to the real world? 670 million miles an hour, which is relevant only because Jupiter's about 500 million miles away. That gives you some context. Okay, I say now the real question is, and it's multiple choice, how long does it take at 1 G to get to the speed of light? 1,000 years, 100 years, 10 years, or 1? How many think it's 1,000 years? A lot of hands go up. How many think it's 100, then 10, and then 1? The real answer is 1. It only takes 1 year at 1 G to get close to the speed of light. Now, enlarge on that a little bit. Many people want to have half an Einstein. Oh, the speed of light's the limit. They don't say, yeah, but as you get close to the speed of light, time slows down for things moving that fast. How much? Depends on how long you accelerate. At 99.9% of the speed of light, you can go 37 light years in 6 months pilot time. You go out, come back, marry your granddaughter's best friend. It's the gift of immortality. This is reality. Those particles accelerated at that Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Europe. 99.99999% of the speed of light. So we know something about that. In other words, when people say it violates the laws of physics, they mean they haven't done their homework to see how this could be done. I find that over and over and over again. You don't have to do any thinking. If you're wondering, incidentally, how could that astronomer be so far off? He assumed a one-stage rocket. We knew long before that multiple stages is much more efficient. He assumed a limit of 1 G acceleration. Pilots routinely take 5 Gs. The escape tower on the Saturn V for the astronauts would have given them 13 Gs to get them the heck off the top if there was something wrong at the bottom of the rocket. There is a real world out there. Oh, he also assumed the rocket has to provide all the energy. He never heard of cosmic freeloading, gravitational assist. When we go to the moon, there's a launch window. Not to meet TV channel regulations, but because we want to take advantage of the moon. If you fire the rocket at the right time, the moon will come along and give you a freebie. The Cassini spacecraft out at Saturn was sent past Venus, which is closer to the sun, given a free kick to go past Earth, given another free kick, and given another free kick at Jupiter. Being smart is more important than being powerful. Oh, he assumed that the only way you could slow down was a retro rocket, which is dead weight. You got to lift it, slow it down at the moon, lift it again, slow it down back here. What do? We say, thank you, God, for giving us an atmosphere. It gives us air to breathe, which is nice. And if we're smart, we can use it to slow down. Remember Apollo, was it 13? You better get the angle right. Because if it's too steep, you dig a hole in the ground, and too shallow, it's bye-bye. Being smart is important. So you will find over and over again people using phrases like it would violate the laws of physics and therefore supernatural or something like that. No, sorry. Well, let me give you a silly example, but it's relevant. Originally, to go to the moon, we were going to use 2 Saturn V launches. They rendezvous in Earth orbit, then go off to the moon, then come back. One engineer went to von Braun and showed him, if we use lunar orbit rendezvous, we could get by with 1 launch. They ran through the equations. That's what we did. It's a heck of a lot easier if you can get by with 1 rocket instead of 2 because of weather and other problems like that and so forth. Being smart is important. And so the people who tell you it can't be done don't know what they're talking about. They mean, I don't know how to do that, therefore nobody does, which is kind of strained thinking, if you don't mind my saying so. Other questions? Yes. I can't hear you. Can you stand up and... Can somebody who heard... my hearing is going, I guess. As a nuclear physicist, come on up. The weather's nice up here. It's okay. Am I not being heard? Oh. Yes, good idea.
The question was that, as a nuclear physicist, have you witnessed or took in consideration that the engines that power these vehicles don't really defy physics, but is based on sacred geometry or the Merkabah in Judaism?
Do I think that they're based on sacred geometry?
Yes.
I have no reason to think that. That doesn't mean I think they're not. Absence of evidence is not evidence for absence. Right. So I don't know where sacred geometry fits into this. What I think you'll find, you start looking at technology, you'll find there's a lot of smart engineers out there who figure out clever ways of doing things. And, you could make a whole long list of things that come up with the unexpected and about which the nasty, noisy negativist will say, absolutely impossible. Oh, I hadn't thought of that as the usual response when you point out the real world. So sacred geometry may work or not. I don't know where it fits into the picture. I plead ignorance. Other questions? Yes? Our accelerations run several Gs. No question about that. It doesn't need to be very long. Most of the time we go to the moon, I think there's 17 minutes of powered flight. We're coasting the rest of the way. The idea is to get out of the atmosphere, take advantage of the moon, and let's be on our way, folks. Some people, there's a book about Area 51, which has a lot of dumb things in it. You've heard about the best explanation for Roswell? Oh, it's a doozy. Stalin hired Dr. Death to create deformed humans, because he was a bad guy, and then somehow a Horton Brothers flying wing was sent to crash in New Mexico, and that was going to cause panic the way War of the Worlds caused panic back in 1938 in New Jersey. The densest population state, incidentally, and New Mexico is one of the least densely populated places. Anyway, in the course of there, she's talking about nuclear stuff. She's violently anti-nuclear. And she's acting as if a nuclear rocket would be firing the whole time it's up there. You give it a burst and away you go, just like the Saturn thing. It's not firing the whole time. It's firing very little of the time. So to get back to your question, which was, give it to me again. Well, the speeds just depend on how long you're accelerating, that's all. So 1G at 1 year gives you the speed of light, which is kind of neat. 2 Gs, half a year, which is also kind of neat, frankly. And that's the thing. You don't see people putting practical numbers into these things, but the engineers do. And the top individual acceleration people who stood, Dr. Stapp, who worked on those rockets, rocket sleds, accelerated up and stopped quickly. One time it got a little out of hand. He got up to like 618 miles an hour and stopped in about a second. Took 43 Gs and lived to tell the tale. His eyeballs hurt like hell. So there are all kinds of restrictions and all kinds of people who have stood high G loadings. Now, did you ever notice that the astronauts go up on their back? There are 3 important things about acceleration. One is the duration of the acceleration. A second is the magnitude of the acceleration, 3 Gs, 6 Gs, 12 Gs, whatever. And the third is the direction with regard to the body. Well, it turns out the way man is built, and women too, back to front you can stand a lot more than feet to head. The joints and knees don't like high acceleration. So there's no simple answers to how much you can stand, for how long. Actually, you can stand, measured data, 30 Gs for 1 second. That's 0 to 600 miles an hour in 1 second. I'm not willing to go on that sled, I would say, but that's measured data. And it's quite spectacular. And if you notice, when you hear reports about flying saucers, they make sudden changes of direction. They don't slow down when they get to the corner and then speed up when they get by. Very short burst. I think it depends. I think you can stand any G loading if the time is shorter than the time it takes a sound wave to go through the system. No chance for the body to react. Lucky. Other questions? Now I'm really getting close to my time, I guess. I'm sorry about that. Yes. I'm sorry. Can you come up to the microphone? Or? Well, I missed part of that. You said I talked about reports that are classified. Did you? Okay, other countries have released a lot of data, just as the U.S. has. Unfortunately, it's not the top secret information. That's why I showed that particular blacked out document, but I should have showed you, I thought it was in there, whited out documents from the National Security Agency, NSA. They released 156 top secret Umbra UFO documents. Wow! You can read 2 or 3 lines per page. Everything else is whited out. You don't have access to that stuff. And I've talked to people from overseas. Brazil is putting out a little formerly top secret stuff. And Chile may be a little too. I haven't seen much Russian stuff, or French or English top secret stuff. And it's a very important distinction. Very important. Because you've got the secret stuff doesn't mean you have access to the top secret stuff. And that's the good stuff.
Let's give Stan a big round of applause.